For those of you who've watched my channel before, obviously my surroundings here are completely different. I've moved since my last video that I posted, and I'll probably be moving again. I'm working right now on an office space that'll probably take a few months, but we'll get there, and that'll be hopefully a more permanent place to record videos and do editing and all those things. But right now, we're gonna talk about something that you've probably heard a little bit about, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 4 to 6 weeks, and that is the NPRM on Remote ID. So let's get going. So first of all, let's just have a little discussion about what remote ID is. So the FAA was tasked by Congress with coming up with a way to help track drones. There's a lot of concerns about security and the fact that drones can be flown anywhere, but the operator can be in a completely different location. There are some valid concerns to be had there as far as being able to tie a drone to the person that's operating it. So what the FAA did was put together a rulemaking committee. This was a whole bunch of interests. Some of them were drone companies, but some of them were not. Some of them were security agencies and different things. They came together, they met for a couple months off and on in order to come together and try and establish some recommendations to the FAA for the remote ID rules. And they took feedback from the FAA, they asked questions to try and get more information to properly put together what the FAA wanted to see on remote ID. Then the Notice for Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM, was released, and it basically was completely different from what the ARC had recommended. So under this proposed rule, there would be 3 different types of flights that could be performed, and the first one is standard remote ID. Now, this requires your drone to not only locally from itself using Wi-Fi or Bluetooth broadcast out a signal with all kinds of information, but it also requires it to connect to a cell phone network or the internet in some way, whether that's through a Wi-Fi connection to a phone, or that could in theory be a SIM card for a direct connection that's on your control station, or even a direct connection your drone has with a SIM card in it. When connected to the internet, it would then log into a unmanned service provider, or a USS as the FAA calls them, and they would record the information that is also being broadcast locally from the drone. The exact same elements would be recorded then on the web onto a server and put into a database. Now, there's been a lot of misunderstanding on this network portion of standard remote ID. You might have heard that if you don't have internet, you can't fly your drone. That is actually not true according to the NPRM. It specifically states in there that if you don't have an internet connection for some reason, let's say you're out in a rural area or you're in a place where there's just no internet available, then you can still perform your flight as long as your drone can still broadcast locally from itself. Now, if your drone can't broadcast locally, then you are dead in the water and you cannot take off. But without internet, you can still perform an operation. It's just they want that there when it's available. Now, the second type of remote ID is limited remote ID, and this appears to be geared more towards the FPV side of things. Under limited remote ID, you can only fly 400 feet from your ground station. So that means 400 feet vertically and 400 feet horizontally, or the combination of the two. So it's like a 400-foot bubble around you. And the way that they record the information is through the network. So your drone would be connected to your control station then would be connected to the network and broadcasting that information to a USS to record through the internet. So there's no local broadcast coming from the drone, but you can't fly very far away anyway. So the third type of remote ID is for drones that just don't have the ability to do any kind of broadcast. They have no network connection, no local broadcast, and these drones are required to be flown at FRIAs, or FAA recognized identification areas. So these are specific sites that have to be applied for to the FAA, and once applied for, the FAA reviews and approves them and says, okay, you are now a place that people can fly drones that don't have remote ID. So the required broadcast elements under remote ID are the same for both network and standard remote ID, and these items include the operator's location and altitude, the drone's location and altitude, an emergency code, like if the drone has lost its signal to the control station and is in a return to home pattern, that would be something broadcast, and the main one is the serial number, which is tied to the firmware of the drone and can't be changed. In order to apply for one of these FRIAs, you have to be a community-based organization, like the AMA would be a great example of that. So these won't be something available to the average Joe to just go and apply for your house to be part of one of these where you can fly drones without remote ID, or your backyard or whatever. This is specifically going to be probably a lot of AMA fields. Now I want to go into some of the problems with remote ID as it was proposed, but I want everyone to remember this is only a proposed rule. It is not a final rule. So this does not go into effect yet. There is still a chance for us to comment on remote ID until March 2nd, and then at that point the FAA has to review all of the comments, and then the final rule will be crafted and released. But even once the final rule is crafted and released based on the NPRM, they want to give manufacturers 2 years to come up with remote ID compliant drones, and then give us as operators an additional 1 year in order to be using compliant drones. So that's basically roughly a 3-year timeline once the final rule is released. And I bet we are at least a year away from seeing that. So we're probably looking at sometime 4 years out before we'll be required to be remote ID compliant. So what are some of the issues with remote ID? So first of all, let's talk about drones that are already existing. There's a lot of questions right now that are unanswered as to whether existing drones would be compliant or not under remote ID. So one of those is the altitude of the control station has to be recorded through a barometer. And I know for a fact that DJI drones do not have a barometer on board the control station. Now that being said, that doesn't mean you can't attach a phone that has a barometer and it can use that to record the altitude of the control station, but inherently the drones don't have that ability right now. The FAA also wants to require an ANSI serial number system that existing drones do not use. There is the potential that this could be done through a firmware update where all the drones then have a different serial number and they are all compliant. However, we just don't know right now, and to be honest, I don't think it makes sense for manufacturers to spend too much time digging into this stuff when this is only a proposed rule and not a final rule. This isn't something that will for sure take effect. So keep in mind that there is a good chance that a lot of drones on the market may not end up being compliant, but there is also the chance that some of them, through various methods or various upgrades, could be brought into compliance. But I would say that when people tell you either your drone is or is not able to be compliant, at this point we honestly just aren't sure yet. The bigger issue on the manufacturing side comes from the fact that small and mid-sized manufacturers are going to struggle to meet compliance under the NPRM. So basically, once a drone model is created, designed, and they've had some prototypes made and all that, they have to figure out how they're going to be compliant with remote ID. Then they have to submit that model's information and all the serial numbers that are going to be released for that model and give that to the FAA, and it has to be declared compliant. So right now they're looking at the paperwork for this costing anywhere between $20,000 and $30,000 to have an aviation attorney fill that out. And then beyond that, there's continued testing to make sure that your remote ID system will remain compliant in the future and isn't having problems where it's suddenly falling out of compliance. So that's additional costs down the road. Now for a company like DJI that has, half a dozen models out there, and each one of those is going to cost 30, 40, let's call it 50 grand. That's not a big deal for them. They sell so many drones that that's just a drop in the bucket. However, when you talk about small manufacturers that are making maybe a dozen drones a year, but building really high quality custom cinema rigs, or even when you look at hobbyists who create their own drones out of foam board and all that, there's no way for them to meet those requirements that the FAA put forward to create a remote ID compliant drone or aircraft on their own. They're not going to spend $30,000 to declare that drone is compliant to the FAA. It's just not going to happen. So to me, there's quite a lot of hurdles here in the manufacturing side that not only create problems for small manufacturers, but also create problems for hobbyists that don't want to fly at one of those free or FAA recognized identification areas. So from the commercial side of drones, there's not a ton that's going to affect us. We're probably mostly still all going to fly and be compliant with whatever the law is, because that's what we do. We like to be compliant to protect our customers. The biggest issue I see for commercial operators is the fact that your operational location will be broadcast publicly under the NPRM. So that means anyone in the public who has an app on their phone that can receive the signal from your drone will be able to look at that app and not only see your drone's location, but also see where you as an operator are locating from. Now, the reason this is a problem is that there are definitely people out there who don't like drones and don't like drone operators and want to cause problems. I've even myself had someone threaten to shoot down a drone. And those are not the kind of people you want bothering you while you're out trying to perform an operation. Now, when I'm flying a drone, I'm constantly looking at battery voltages, alerts that come up on the screen, the specific shots I'm getting on screen, plus my shot list to make sure I'm getting the shots my clients want. I'm also trying to make sure nothing is in the way of my drone or below my drone. Very busy while I'm flying, trying to make sure I'm flying compliant and flying safe. The last thing I need is for people who can look up my location to be coming up to me and asking me questions or threatening me while I'm flying. One of the reasons they bring up an operator's location being public information is that pilots are always attached to a plane, and therefore you can always tell who a pilot is with a plane. But generally, and this is not always the rule, but generally planes are taking off from secured locations, either private property where no one else has permission, or an airport that is secured. This gives them a level of safety that we as drone operators don't have. So handing our location to the public is not a good idea. It just should be something available only to law enforcement and federal officials who need that information, not to any Joe Schmo who can download an app. There are also privacy issues as related to the network broadcasting side of remote ID that would affect commercial operators potentially. I'm not going to go into all that, it's not my area of expertise. To me, the biggest people that lose out under remote ID are hobbyists. When you talk about FRIAs, or those FAA recognized identification areas I discussed a little bit earlier, those have to be applied for by a CBO, and there's only a few of those out there, and they only have a 12-month window for application. After the 12-month window, there will be no more that can be applied for. And then even at that, the FAA states they have to be renewed every few years, and the FAA might decide not to renew them, or that some of them may just not be renewed and may just go away. So that means the FAA can already see a day when they won't renew any more FRIAs and they just disappear. So if you're trying to fly something that's a foam board aircraft that doesn't have remote ID, you're out. You have nowhere that you can fly your drone. To me, it makes much more sense for FRIAs always to be able to be applied for, and that even municipalities or local governments could apply for a FRIA. If my parks department wanted to apply for a FRIA, they should be allowed to do that. That way they can have an area that's safe for drone flyers or model aircraft people to go and fly that's not necessarily a AMA field, which aren't always publicly available locations. We need to have places for people to fly even if they're not a member of a CBO. Some of the justifications for remote ID also bother me in the NPRM. Some of the big things brought up are terrorism and the security concerns with airports and all that stuff. The reason this bothers me is that remote ID will absolutely help with ignorant operators who fly too close to an airport or try to fly over a stadium because they don't know the laws. They will absolutely be caught and dealt with. However, if someone is out there and truly wants to cause harm, they're not going to use a remote ID compliant drone. All the millions of drones already on the market are not remote ID compliant, and they could use any of those to do the nefarious things they want to do, or frankly, they could build their own custom aircraft that's not going to have remote ID aboard and do whatever they want. So in my mind, when it comes to sensitive areas and locations, detection is still going to be very, very key when it comes to tracking drones and understanding what drones are in an area. Now, there are dozens of other items I could discuss that are problems with remote ID, but to me, these are some of the most obvious ones and the ones that bother me the most. To me, the FAA should have listened to the ARC, the rulemaking committee that they put in place that gave a tiered approach to remote ID, where standard 107 operations and hobbyists would only need to do a local broadcast system from the drone or the aircraft that would be available to those that are in the vicinity to look at. And then for more advanced operations, like if you're flying under 107 with a waiver that allows you to go beyond line of sight, or flying at night, some of those other things, then you might need to add in that second tier and have network broadcast. And then for very complex operations like package delivery, you would also be required to broadcast not just locally but over the network to have a record of that information. To me, this approach made much more sense, and most existing drones would be compliant with a simple firmware update. As well, there wouldn't be nearly the burden on manufacturers that would be put on them under the proposed rule that was released by the FAA. If you haven't commented on remote ID already, please do. I will leave a link down in the description for you to know where to go to do that. Make sure you educate yourself first though. We don't want to have a bunch of comments that are just screw FAA or we hate you guys or that. We want to actually have informed comments that leave them not only feedback on what the problems are, but also solutions to help create a better final remote ID rule. Thanks for watching. Please like this video. Make sure you share it too. We really need everyone who cares about drones and the RC hobby to leave a comment for the FAA. Safe flying.